Good evening, everybody. This is Samantha Milanovsky. I am the Public Works Director and Floodplain Administrator for the City of Miles City. And this is our first presentation concerning our Flood Awareness Day here in Miles City. Tracy Sears with DNRC is going to present on Floodplain Program and disclosure provisions.
Great. Well, thank you, Sam, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this year's Flood Awareness Days in Miles City. I think this is one of two presentations I'm providing today. Wanted to look into the floodplain program and really focus this first presentation on the floodplain program in general, and also the disclosure provisions, which I know that there's a lot of folks that don't realize that there's actual regulations in place at the state concerning flood properties in the floodplain and the requirement for disclosure. So we're going to hit on that today. So let me see here. Okay, as Sam mentioned, my name is Tracy Sears, and I'm with Montana DNRC. I'm actually out of the Helena office in the DNRC Floodplain Program. One of the main things about the floodplain program is we get into the weeds about the program itself. The biggest thing about the program was that it was designed to reduce flood losses and flood damage. That's the whole premise of the program. And one of the things, as we're kind of emphasizing the disclosure provision, is really to focus not only on the program elements that are just general, like kind of requirements, but how you can look up specific information and really try to protect yourself, especially if you are representing folks that have property in and around the floodplain or have been flooded before, or if you yourself in your property, if you're looking at possibly selling or possibly buying in these areas, how can you protect yourself, especially if you're looking at property in and around the floodplain? So one of the things before we get into the program information is kind of really setting up the landscape of, who pays when a property is damaged. I mean, looking at the disclosure provision, the reason behind this, why their disclosure provision was kind of implemented back in the 70s. And it goes back to this fundamental question. When we're talking about floods and litigation, who pays when that property is damaged? Well, what we've seen is that individuals will take a look and find out, one, were there things that they can do, or was somebody else responsible for what happened. And so when they start going down this road, especially if they didn't have flood insurance, if they can't cover their losses, they're going to look at everything that happened. How did they purchase the property? Was there information that was withheld from them when they purchased that property? Were there things they could have done that could have prevented the damage? Let's say somebody allowed them to build in this area, i.e. the community allowed them to build in a certain manner. Did that put them in danger? Were they required to build up to that floodplain requirement as per the local community ordinances? They're going to look at any avenue to see who maybe can help them recoup their costs. And of course, that comes in the form of litigation. And we are seeing that more and more, even in Montana. We have seen a lot of cases that have come up, and there's a lot of information, especially, that we've been, communities are having to provide, especially when it comes to these disclosure provisions, and individuals saying, wait a minute, we had no idea that we were in the floodplain, or that there was a risk of flooding onto our property. So that's what they're going to look at. What information was kind of withheld, and did someone else's actions cause or worsen the damage? So the disclosure provision, that's not only in state regulations, but it's also in local ordinances, local floodplain ordinances, talks about how any property owner or anybody representing that property owner, if it's within that regulated flood hazard area and is subject to regulation, any permitted uses that are transferred, if they've withheld any information, like they didn't disclose to somebody that that property was in the floodplain, possibly they didn't disclose that the structure has been flooded previously, they can be held accountable, because this disclosure provision is pretty clean cut. I mean, this is one that we talk to realtors about all the time as well, just making sure they are doing their due diligence and providing this information to property owners, or potential buyers, and also maybe they're representing someone that just they maybe have paid cash, or they had their property has been paid off. They didn't have to get flood insurance. They've never had any issues, but their home is in. Maybe they weren't aware that it was in the floodplain. You know, there's a lot of things that you can do to kind of find out this information, and that's what we're going to kind of go over tonight. So as we talk about who pays if something happens to somebody's property, we saw a lot of unfortunate situations from the 2022 flood event. There were quite a few homes, unfortunately, that were completely damaged, or what we would call substantially damaged, in those floods. Some of them went down the river, and there were a lot of situations where homes were built that didn't get proper permits, whether it was floodplain or septic permits. They didn't have those in place. And so there has been a lot of discussion about, wait a minute, why was this not disclosed that we were in here? So understanding this kind of realm, disasters are very, very difficult. And when somebody is impacted, if they did not have that self-help, let's say they are unable to obtain another loan, they didn't take out insurance, the next step for them is typically litigation. And that's where we're seeing this rise, not just from the 2022 flood event, but we're also seeing it after COVID, where individuals bought properties sight unseen and paid cash for them, and then they were trying to do upgrades, or maybe they were trying to take a loan out, and lo and behold, they found out, wait a minute, our property is actually in the floodplain, and maybe their lender's requiring them to pay a fairly high premium, or they can't sell the property. We are seeing this type of activity get more frequent here in the state. So as we get into the National Flood Insurance Program, one of the leading managing principles of the program is this concept of no adverse impact. What it means, and this is kind of where this disclosure provision came out, and it was kind of placed in the state regulations. It really is trying to protect, you know, it's getting to the essence of property rights. It's saying anything that somebody does on their property should not impact adjacent property owners or that property itself. And so that no adverse impact, that's one of those managing principles that the floodplain program has been kind of designed around. It's making sure that any type of new development, or maybe if somebody is doing renovations or adding an addition, what is that activity or that type of development? How is it going to impact that property and the surrounding properties and the community at whole? Maybe they're looking at trying to do work in a stream. How is that work going to impact adjacent landowners, the community, or maybe even adjacent communities as well? It just is saying, trying to make sure to be mindful of things that are of how development is occurring in these areas and how that development can impact others as well. So Montana currently has 138 communities that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. And the community regulations are tied to those areas within the community that have mapped floodplains. So we have in the state over 73,000 river miles, but you can see there's only a certain percentage of that 73,000. I mean, it's close to about 12,000 that is actually mapped. And those mapped areas are the ones that are tied into those local floodplain regulations. And it's super important, this main piece of understanding the National Flood Insurance Program is understanding that even after these disasters, doesn't matter if it was a disaster, if it was a flood disaster, or in some situations, you know, in Montana, we're very susceptible to earthquakes. If it's an earthquake, if they're rebuilding in these areas, especially special flood hazard area, there are provisions that the program looks at to deal with existing structures. And the whole reason for that is to really, again, go back to that main premise of the program, to reduce flood losses and flood damages, and trying to make sure that people are building back in a manner that they're not going to be vulnerable again to flood losses or damages in the future. Also making sure, hopefully, they're not going to be vulnerable to higher premium rates when it comes to insurance. So in Montana, one of the things that we try to talk about is the fact that we are not immune to flooding in the state as well. But as we really start diving into this program, I just want to really say the big takeaway is, when in doubt, please contact your local floodplain administrator. For Miles City, most of you know and probably interacted with Sam, who kind of did the introduction today. Super important that whatever you're doing, please reach out to your local floodplain administrator. Set up a pre-application meeting. That goes a long way. She can kind of provide some insight on any proposed projects that you might have. The other thing that we talk about, and this is something that it's not just being said in Montana, it's known around the world. This is a great quote by Gilbert White, is that the floods are acts of nature, but flood losses are largely acts of man. And I think a lot of times when we were working with communities and property owners throughout the state, a lot of individuals are trying to do the right thing. And this picture here is a perfect example of somebody that was really trying to do the right thing. This home was actually, it's on the Clarks Fork River. It was actually a fairly new built home. It was out of the floodplain, completely out of the floodplain. But in 1997, the Clark Fork River had an extensive amount of high water that was going through, and it was causing a lot of erosion issues, some flooding, but a lot of erosion issues. This particular home here, the property owner, the homeowner, actually knew about the floodplain program and wanted to make sure that he was safe. Unfortunately, the river eroded at such an alarming rate that it eroded to the point where they could not even get they actually had trucks in there to try to move the structure, but the ground kept kind of started crumbling underneath the equipment. So they had to get out of there, but they had to burn the structure so it wouldn't hit a bridge downstream. But again, best intentions to try to be mindful of the hazards in and around these areas. But really, a lot of times when we're dealing with situations, when people are building, especially right on a tributary or close or near to a tributary, there are concerns not only with erosion but with flooding. Now in Miles City, we saw a lot of rain events or localized flooding that occurs that creates a lot of problems in the city itself as well. But with the Tongue and Yellowstone right there, there are concerns too with the community. But you're not alone. A lot of communities, when we look at floodplain management history, a lot of communities were built in and around water. Miles City is no exception. Before the National Flood Insurance Program, how the program, or as a nation, how we were dealing with flood control was really looking at flood control structures. And for the most part, and it continues to be that way, in Miles City as an example as well, is for most of the time, these flood control structures are able to withstand these events. But sometimes either the structures get compromised over time or not maintained, or in the case of Minot, because they actually had a brand new levee that went there that was in here before the 2011 flood event. There's an event that just exceeds the building design for that particular flood control structure. So as I mentioned before, Montana is not immune to flooding. We actually have had a lot of flooding throughout our history as a state, just like every other state sees flooding events. And there was a lot of flood control structures, especially after the 1964, the big flood of 1964, that went up and were erected around the state as well. Quite a bit of money was spent, federal money was spent to help try to protect communities. So as we were looking at the flood control structures, problems with some of them, experiencing events that exceeded what they were built for throughout the nation, what we continued to see was that development in flood-prone areas continued to go up, and disaster relief payouts for flood damage was being asked more and more. And one of the reasons for that was the availability of flood insurance was non-existent before the National Flood Insurance Program, because back in 1929, most of the private insurance companies stopped selling flood insurance. And so as a nation, we were pretty vulnerable, especially when it came to flooding. So the National Flood Insurance Program wasn't done in a vacuum. It was actually created, and they had individuals that were working on it for decades. You know, of course, flooding is the #1 natural disaster in the United States, and we had an issue with floods. How do we deal with it? And this is the program that got introduced through Congress, the National Flood Insurance Program. Of course, the focus was a lot of the push was looking at insurance and making insurance available after these events. But really, this was a unified program, and there's 4 parts to the National Flood Insurance Program. It's knowing where that risk is. So it's looking at your maps. It's understanding how to manage that risk, or what you would normally reference as your regulations or floodplain management. There's also the flood insurance component, which was huge, especially to lenders. They wanted to make sure they were protecting their investment. Also, communities. It's horrible when a community is impacted by any type of disaster, let alone a flood. It's very, very difficult for recovery. It takes a long time. And making sure that folks have flood insurance so they can try to get back to as much normal as possible after those events is super important. And then, of course, flood mitigation. All these pieces are part of the National Flood Insurance Program. I think it's really important to point out too, we see a lot of we really work with a lot of communities as they're dealing on mitigation. And mitigation, you know, we have on the slide, it can save $4 in response costs over long term. They're actually showing figures as high as $7 and $14 over the long term. And mitigation is something that communities are working on daily for not just flood, but all types of natural hazards. So when a community is entering into the National Flood Insurance Program, they have to make an application, and they're making an agreement with the federal government. The federal government will provide flood insurance and disaster assistance within the community. In return, a local community has to adopt and enforce floodplain regulations that meet or exceed the federal and state requirements. Now, they do say it's a voluntary program, but there's a lot of things that are tied to this program. And the other thing to keep in mind too is there's a lot of industry standards. So knowing that, yes, we're talking about the National Flood Insurance Program, but know that nationwide and internationally, I mean, you've probably seen it on the news as well. They know what structures can withstand these events. And if somebody's going to be lending money, they're going to look at how these structures are being built. Now, we see this with floodplain. We're also hearing this information coming around when it's coming to wildfires, how are structures built in wildfires and earthquakes. Just looking at the footage of the devastation in Asia with some of the earthquakes, and you can see the buildings in the countries that had really high standards for earthquake and those that didn't, and how those structures were able to withstand certain things. Same thing with flooding. We see it here in the state. Those structures that were built based on the local regulations actually fared fairly well and had minimal damage compared to those that were built out of compliance, or maybe they were built prior to any regulations going in place. So I think it's really important to kind of understand that this information, it's not just beholden like what the lenders and insurance companies are looking at to what the National Flood Insurance requirements and program are. They're looking at industry standards as well. So FEMA administers the National Flood Insurance Program. The state of Montana actually has regulations that say we are to try to, they had to establish a group that was going to help communities, and by providing that technical assistance to communities to help them run their local floodplain program. And so we kind of act as a liaison between local communities and FEMA, but the bulk of the program falls on the local communities to enforce the National Flood Insurance Program. And we've kind of already discussed this, why kind of manage these floodplains. Again, trying to make sure that flood insurance is available, and hopefully by managing these floodplains, and I think Miles City does a really good job on managing a floodplain, hopefully they're keeping these premium costs pretty low for property owners, or lower than what the average is. Looking at hopefully disaster relief funding, and and also providing better emergency response. All of these things kind of work together with the local program. But ultimately, it goes back to that keeping people safe from flooding and hopefully reducing those impacts, not just on those property owners, but also on the communities as well. So we do hear a lot, like hurricanes are number one natural disaster in the country. Unfortunately, flooding is the number one natural disaster. If you look at what's going on right now with Missouri and Kentucky and Tennessee, those states have been hit over and over and over again with flooding. In the last few years, they have just been inundated with flood issues. Riverine flooding is almost as high as the coastal flooding damages that we see. So yes, you know, kind of take out that component of hurricanes and understand that it's flooding in general. That's the number one natural disaster. And it's not just hurricane, it could be riverine, it could be localized flooding like Miles City has experienced as well. Again, knowing that in Montana, we continue to see flood events occur throughout, we've seen it more frequent in the last, since I started working with the state. I think 2011 started kind of kicking off this unfortunate cycle that we were seeing a lot of flooding that's occurring or high water that's causing like erosion issues like in this picture here in Yellowstone. Other things that we hear too, and a lot of you might fall in this category. I know we kind of fall in this category too, that we've been in our home for a long time and water hasn't come near the house, that we just don't really have to worry about flooding. But ultimately, if you're in that, especially that special flood hazard area where there's a 1% chance, or it falls under that 100-year flood event, may not have occurred in the last 60 years, it doesn't mean that it can't occur. And that's what we saw kind of in Muscle Shell. Muscle Shell and Roundup before 2011, it had been what they had thought had been a long time since they had seen a flooding event. And they thought a lot of flood control structures up the stream were kind of controlling some of the flooding. And so they really weren't prepared, even when Golden Valley was calling and saying, hey, you have a wall of water coming down. They just really weren't prepared. They didn't think that it would happen. Now, unfortunately, 2011, they got flooded not once, but they got flooded twice within a 2-week period, all of them exceeding that 100-year flood event or that 1% annual chance. And the Muscle Shell River itself was completely changed after this major event. And then if you kind of go back, you can see there's been a long history of flooding in Muscle Shell and Roundup. But when I started working with the state in 2007, Muscle Shell and Roundup were talking about getting out of program because they didn't think they had a flood threat. And that's a pretty common theme, not just in Montana. Like we've heard that before, like there's not a threat. And I think it's become, as we're seeing more and more of these events occur, I think more communities are getting a little bit more savvy, like, yes, there is a risk here. And that's the same thing, like when we look at the unfortunate devastation in Asheville, North Carolina, and in Tennessee. If you look at like Asheville, North Carolina, their city website prior to this event, and I think it's still up there, 2 years prior to Helene causing all the historic flooding from this last fall, you could see that North Carolina, they had almost an identical system come through that area 100 years, about 102 years prior to Helene. So there was a history and they knew that this could kind of occur. And so they, on their city website, they actually had information concerning, they wanted to bring up that 100-year flood event that had occurred there. And so if you look at the information of what happened then and then what happened just a few years ago, you can see, unfortunately, they are vulnerable to flooding as well. But the big thing on when we're dealing, especially with communities that are kind of vulnerable to flood events, is that, God forbid, if there is a situation where they do get flooded, the problem that most communities, it's not just the upfront blue sky permitting that is hard. The recovery after floods can be difficult, and it is a long, long process. And Roundup and Muscle Shell they're an example of communities that understand this. They have a lot of their elected officials that are well, unfortunately, well versed in flooding and disasters and trying to make their communities more resilient so they don't have to go through it again, or if they do get impacted, the impact would hopefully be minimal. So we're looking at the National Flood Insurance Program. One of the ways when we're talking about the disclosure provision to kind of protect yourself is kind of understanding what areas are actually in that mapped area that you want to make sure you kind of disclose, let people know. And, you know, when we're looking at the maps, one of the things, how those maps are kind of created is they're really looking at the watersheds in that area that can impact or create flooding and inundation in those communities. And so as development occurs, those watersheds can change over time. They can and they do change over time. And so that's kind of why it's important to manage those areas. Those floodplain maps, they actually identify flood risk. They're used by many individuals, including emergency managers and floodplain administrators, planners, also the insurance company. And they do have different levels of detail. But what makes up that floodplain is there's a couple parts, especially in Miles City. You're looking at the area that you probably have heard referenced called the floodway and then the flood fringe. Now, we'll go over this again, but the floodway are those areas essentially that you're looking at that would probably have the deeper depths and the higher velocity. Those are the areas that are kind of more restrictive, but the flood fringe are areas that you may be able to do a little bit more development. You just have to do it differently. So the flood maps look at different risks. So the high risk zone is what your local ordinance, especially in Miles City, is tied to. But there's also areas that are showing up that show moderate risk zones or low risk zones. Those are areas that you can look at that maybe if you're in that moderate risk zone, you still want to take precautions. Maybe don't drop a basement, especially if you know there's a high groundwater table in that location as well. So where do you find this information as far as mapping is concerned? You can look to the county or city website on the floodplain administrator. Where a lot of folks will look for this information is on the FEMA Map Service Center. So it doesn't take much to look for your property, or if you're representing somebody, or if you know somebody that's trying to like buy property in that area, you can jump on FEMA's Map Service Center, or you can contact the DNRC if you can't get a hold of folks as well. FEMA, for Miles City, you can access the map information from two different map service portals through FEMA. One of them is the National Flood Hazard Layer. And on the National Flood Hazard Layer, what's really good is you can just kind of type in your location and it's going to bring up that information. You know, that location, it'll put a little pin on there and say, here's your location. You can see it in reference to the flood insurance rate maps. And on this map that you're looking at, the area that's in blue and the area that has the red hash are all part of that special flood hazard area. The red hash area is that area that's in the floodway. So you can also use the Map Service Center to look up all products to find out, to just get like what we'd see like a paper flood insurance rate map panel. And you can go on there and just take a look at the effective products that they have. You can even look at the historic products as well. That would help you. But if you go to that Map Service Center, you can download maps in the flood insurance study too that can kind of help you. So essentially, Miles City has what we call a detailed study maps, and so that shows both the floodway and the flood fringe. And that high risk area again is the area in the blue, and the area that's designated as the floodway in the red hatch. And then of course this brown area is at moderate risk. So it's not that they have to get a permit, but I always talk to folks that are building in moderate risk areas. So you know you may want to build just a little bit higher because a lot of claims, a lot of flood damage occurs outside even that 100-year floodplain. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But that high risk area, if you're in that special flood hazard area, there's 25% chance of flooding during a 30-year mortgage. And that's based on information that they have gathered over the years after disasters. Also, flood insurance is required on buildings with any buildings that have are using federally backed mortgages. Also, floodplain regulations apply. So if any new development, that's any type of man-made development, is going to require a floodplain permit. High-risk areas are also referred to as that 100-year floodplain in that regulated flood hazard area. So I think for the most part, we just really wanted to focus on how you can find this information, give you a little bit of information about the program itself, but understand that when it comes to those disclosure provisions, you have a lot of help with your local floodplain administrator. You can reach out to DNRC if you can't get a hold of Sam, if things are coming up. But understanding the maps, understanding kind of the risk. I mean, we all all property has some inherent risk that's going to happen, whether it's flooding or they're vulnerable to wildfires or both. Maybe it's earthquakes. There's always things that you want to try to talk to folks and hopefully build in the manner it's going to lessen those risks, especially when it comes to floodplain or those structures that are built in and around floodplains. So just kind of knowing that your floodplain maps provide a lot of information. When you're looking at that floodway, just keep in mind that that's the area that is identified as probably your most vulnerable areas within the communities. And those floodway areas are ones where there's going to be a lot of oversight on what's happening, because things that happen in that floodway can dramatically impact adjacent property owners. So same as the flood fringe, the requirement for flood insurance is the same, but they do have more restrictive floodplain regulations. But I'm hoping that with that general information, hopefully provide you just a little bit more information about the floodplain program and this disclosure provision. And I guess if you have a moment before we switch over to insurance, I guess just a general question. How many of you that are attending tonight, how many of you were aware that there was a disclosure provision for properties in the special flood hazard area? Either you can come off mute or just put it in the chat. And I'll load up my next presentation for you, Sam.
Perfect. And when you do that, I might stop the meeting and then restart it, just because we might put it on the website. So I'm going to stop this real quick.